Looking into the inaction of the Clinton administration during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, one feels a sense of horror at what took, or rather what did not take place. The U.S. non-response could be analyzed through any of Allison and Zelkow's models, but my colleagues and I found the most applicable one to be Model 2, which considers organizational behavior. The model works under a number of assumptions, most fundamentally, for instance, that the constraints under which an organization functions causes the said organization to operate along the existing lines of conduct. For instance, the standards of the professional culture at the organization's priorities and their perceptions of the outside situation and of their own capabilities. This is never truer than in a crisis situation at which time leaders of an organization grow conservatively inclined to stick to existing policies rather than create new ones. The original model analyzes groups as actors rather than individuals, but in some cases my colleagues and I chose to expand a little bit. For instance, to look at certain individuals' struggles in the face of several organizations that could have had the most effect on creating policy to stop the genocide from the beginning, but instead adhered to existing policy and culture. When applying this model to the U.S. non-response to the Rwandan genocide, it becomes clear that a primary reason for the government's behavior was the conflicting priorities of the sub-organizations involved. Each organization's logic of appropriateness drove their respective responses to the issue.
The Clinton administration, specifically in the case of President Clinton, seemed to only be invested in the Rwanda genocide as it pertained to specific individuals. Clinton had one tied to Rwanda, a human rights activist named Monique Mujawamaria that he had met at the White House in 1993. After the breakout of violence in Rwanda, Clinton was concerned about Rwanda events only as they pertained to Mujawamaria. However, after Mujawamaria's rescue, President Clinton apparently lost his interest in the events of Rwanda.
This lack of interest in Rwanda could also be seen in the Pentagon and Congress. Following the events that had taken place in Somalia, both the Pentagon and Congress were incredibly adamant about not engaging in warfare to aid Africa. They firmly believed that peacekeeping in Africa was sure to be met with complications. Therefore, during the Rwandan genocide, they refused military aid. Instead of attempting to find a solution to help prevent the genocide, they categorized their options into two decisions: to do nothing or engage in military warfare. The latter was unthinkable, and so instead they defaulted to inaction. In addition, intervention from the Pentagon would have required a large push from either the civilians or a superior leader in order to get them to act. However, all possible sources of pressure remained silent when it mattered for Rwanda. One of the only voices from within the U.S. government to beg for action in Rwanda came from Prudence Bushnell, the Deputy Assistant Secretary. She attempted to provoke the U.S. government into action. However, as doing so would not adhere to previously stated sub-organizational protocol and policies, her continual demands for action were disregarded. For instance, by the second time she brought up radio jamming, one Pentagon official told her, "Radios don't kill people, people kill people." Instead, Bushnell was assigned the task of calling the Rwandan military and telling them that the U.S. would hold them personally responsible if anything were to happen. As she was but a sole individual not acting within the protocols or opinions of a sub-organization, Bushnell's cry for timely and effective military intervention was disregarded.
Another major problem was the lack of institutional support from the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Part of the problem was manpower. The department was a relatively small office overseeing 70,000 peacekeepers in 17 countries around the world. They were also struggling with the Clinton administration's demand that the UN learn to say no to chancy or costly missions. This became the existing norm, so that although they sent a small force under the command of Canadian Romeo Dallaire, they rejected his requests for anything that could make the mission too costly, to the point that when Dallaire informed them months before the genocide that he was ready to raid a Hutu arms cache, he was forbidden to do so. So the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, though it could have been enormously effective, prioritized other projects over Rwanda due to a professional culture that demanded it focus on cost efficiency and what the U.S. government considered an adequate response, rather than addressing Rwanda as a larger issue.
The U.S. government was only willing to pay the minimum cost to approve policies that would not put its interests at stake, to the point that it became an official policy, PDD 25. This was seen in the way that the U.S. responded to Dallaire's plan for aiding Rwanda. Dallaire had suggested that the U.S. government take an inside-out approach by sending in troops to create safe havens aimed at saving Rwandans and mediating a ceasefire. The U.S. government responded with stating that it would take an outside-in approach by setting up camps on the border for refugees. Although the U.S. government acceded to Dallaire's plan of creating safe havens eventually, the month-long haggling over details meant that when troops were finally sent in, it was too late. The major causes of the United States inaction focused on adherence to pre-existing policies and logic of appropriateness, which led to an unwillingness to change policies in a timely manner. Furthermore, there was no one committee that made a clear push for action on the Rwanda peacekeeping front. One could even make the normative claim that fractionated power in the government led to a dispersion of responsibility, so that no one suborganization felt obligated to act.
The implication of this event for policymaking as a whole through the lens of Model 2 is that organizations are restricted by their pre-existing lines of conduct, which limit flexibility and incremental change. A change within an organization is often a reaction to a dramatic event. Therefore, in order to avoid inaction in a similar situation, there would need to be pre-existing protocols put in place to necessitate action. In addition, a major contribution to avoidance of inaction in the future would be the creation of a more unitary body of principles that would unify professional cultures and priorities interorganizationally. However, it is worth noting that many of the lessons learned are not necessarily within the realm of the government's implementation capacity.
That said, these lessons, if even remotely feasible to implement, could lead to an important shift in the ideals of the larger governmental body, making it more appropriate in the face of similar crises to act than to not act. As Dallaire wrote, this nation, without any hesitation nor doubt, is capable and even expected by the less fortunate of the globe to lead the developed countries beyond self-interest, strategic advantages, and isolationism, and raise their sights to the realm of preeminence of humanism and freedom. Dallaire wrote this about Canada, but we should expect no less from America.